It is the 7:02 hour, and since I am not the main event, I'm going to just get us all started and people will join in. Um, oh, people are still joining. I just wanted to thank everybody who is here. We've had actually like 50 people register for this event, which is amazing. And just so you all know, this is our inaugural event, our inaugural Preservation Book Club. And the concept for this kind of came about, I think it was Donna Jim McPherson of Arizona Preservation Foundation and Alicia Adolph, who is an intern for the Preservation Foundation, and she is also with the Public Allies program. We were all talking about what we were reading, and none of it was necessarily topical, like in terms of the profession of preservation. It was all what I would call preservation adjacent. And we just thought, hey, we should really start providing reviews and putting our what kind of what we're reading up on the website. And I said, well, what's the point if we're not talking about it with others? So then we said, okay, can we make this sort of like every other month meet and find a preservation adjacent book and bring guests from outside the field of historic preservation to come in and moderate us as we work our way through this book. And it just so happened that February was when we decided we would have our first event. And it just so happened that sitting on my desk at that point in time was Clint Smith's brilliant book, How the Word is Passed. So I said, why don't we, I kind of knew what it was about. And I'm really interested in the legacy of slavery in America and how that affects the American psyche. And so I was like, oh, this will be really good. What I didn't realize is how relevant it is to the work of preservation and historic sites management as well. So I think it was just a perfect book to begin with. I couldn't be more happy. Donna is friends with Dr. Pratcher and thought that Dr. Pratcher would be an excellent person to moderate. So we brought him into the mix. So Donna will be introducing Dr. Pratcher in a second. I wanted to talk a little bit about when I say that this book is preservation adjacent. I had heard Clint Smith speak about the book on NPR about a year past, and he actually said something in his NPR interview, and it's actually also in the book, and it was just kind of amusing. I think the quote is, I'm looking over here, there is difference between history and nostalgia, and somewhere between the two is memory. And I really feel that the work of historic preservation sits in that space, that he identifies that space of memory. We all know history with a capital H and history with a lowercase h, contested history. The conception is histories in the past. And nostalgia, we all know nostalgia is sort of history with a deeply personal bent, where it can be somewhat truthy, can be disguised, can be obscured. But when you actively work to preserve the places where history is made, it really puts it in the present, and it allows folks to experience it and embody it the same way you would experience and embody a memory. And I thought that that was just super, super brilliant. I think that's all I have to say about that. I'm hoping we'll return to that theme of the embodiment and the role that sites play, historic sites play, and especially sites that have difficult histories to tell, the role that they play in not just teaching us about who we are, but allowing us to experience the uncomfortableness of our own history. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Donna. And Donna, if you could please introduce our moderator tonight.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Donna Reiner, and I happen to be on the board of the Arizona Preservation Foundation. So I promised Anthony, that's how I always remember him, that I won't gush too much over him. But we first met when he was 15, and he was a volunteer at the museum where I was the director of education. This was a young man who really did like history. And so he just won my heart over very, very quickly. And so over the time of having known him, he went to Howard and got his BA there, and then went to Penn. And he truly is a historian. He's really focused a lot on the history in Arizona. He currently teaches at Barrett, the Honors College at Arizona State University. He's also held appointments at the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon, and at the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity in America at Brown. So he has great credentials, but he's done a lot of reading, writing, and things like that. Currently, he is working on, as we all have at one point, making his PhD work into a tome. And he has published in many journals. And what Anthony brings is, I think, a real knowledge of what African-American history is as a young person, and who has studied a lot of it in the Phoenix area. And so I introduce with great pleasure, Dr. Anthony Pratcher. I didn't gush too much.
You did not. Thank you. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Dr. Reiner. And thank you to the Arizona Preservation Foundation, State Historical Preservation Office, for hosting this book talk. I'm delighted to be here with you all. I see so many names, at least, that are familiar. And there are some that, if we're not familiar, by the end of today, we will be. So I, as Donna was saying, I teach at the Honors College. We have about an hour 15 left in this session. And so I'm going to run this particular book talk in the way that I would run my human event class. So for those of you who are students in the class, this should feel a little bit familiar. Generally, the way that we'll start is with a sort of icebreaker temperature check, just to see how people are going. So what I'd like for everybody to do, and you don't have to, you can just put it in the chat, respond to everybody. I want one word on how this book made you feel. How did the word, when it was passed to you, how did it make you feel? And I just want you to put a word in the chat. In fact, I will start. I'll be honest. So what I'm seeing right now is angry, hopeful, surprised, uncomfortable, ashamed, inspired. I can see that. Unsurprised. Okay, some people know their history maybe a little closer than others. Encouraged. That's absolutely in here. Ignorant. Well, I think one of the points is this is how ignorance is overcome, though. It's through reading, it's through knowledge, and it's through education. Smarter. Very good. I think that one of the ways that I felt a lot of anger, but there's the line that he has. Let me see if I can find it. In the section on, I believe it's on Monticello. If you look on page 36 in your text. Yes, inspired and angry. If you look on page 36 at the bottom of the page, where Smith is talking with what's her name, with where he's talking about the oral history project at Monticello, as it's called, the Getting Word project. But one of the descendants interview for that project, they say, this is how the word is passed down. This is how the word is passed down, which I'm assuming is where the title of the book comes from. But it's this idea that the stories that we're telling, when we tell them to each other, when we come together, when we commune, when we share, when we basically make our understanding known and we come to our collective understanding, it's through that praxis that the word is passed down. So thank you all for this little icebreaker. With that, what I like to do is start with a video just a real quick YouTube clip to give you all a sense of why Clint Smith, why he wrote this book. So what I'll do is I'm going to share my screen, and let me see if I can pull it up. Ooh, you know, the problem is when you have too many tabs on your screen. I have that problem right now. I have too many tabs on my screen. So show all windows. There we go. We'll go with this one. One thing real quick, share sound. I want to make sure everybody can hear this. Okay, so this is a video that I found basically of Clint Smith discussing his video or discussing his book and the origins for it. I just want us all to take a chance to listen to what he's got to say before we get started today.
Was always made clear to me, and it was amplified. I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, in a very mixed race, mixed income community. I had Black friends, white friends, Asian friends. It was like the Disney Channel. It was great. We were riding our bikes with theme music playing in the background. Our hair was blowing in the wind. It's clearly their hair, not my hair. And my dad would always say, he's like, I love that you have such a diverse group of friends. That's why we sent you to this school. That's why we moved to this neighborhood. But you have to understand that the implications for the decisions that you make might be very different for you than they are for your other friends. And when you're a kid, you don't really understand that. You're just like, you're the mean dad. You're the strict dad. Why can't you be more like Tommy's dad? And he's like, Tommy don't live in this house. And then he walks away very dramatically because he was watching too many Denzel Washington movies, but that's another story. And so my sense of who I was always made clear to me, and it was amplified in New Orleans because I grew up in a city that was majority Black, but was also surrounded by Confederate iconography and slaveholding iconography everywhere. The middle school I went to was named after a Confederate general. The street that my parents live on is named after a person who owned over 100 enslaved people. The street that I took to get to school every day was named after Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. And so I was surrounded by this sort of story and this memorialization, this iconography of the Confederacy in a way that always felt strange to me. But when I was young, I didn't really have the language to name it and to understand it. In 2015, they had as many of us remember, the Charleston Massacre, in which Dylan Roof killed 9 people who were in the AME Church in Charleston, Charleston, South Carolina. And in 2015, the city of New Orleans decided that it was going to remove several prominent Confederate statues in the city. And in 2017, they took those statues down. And when that was happening, I was thinking a lot about my childhood in New Orleans. And I was thinking a lot about the ways that the Confederacy was actually memorialized in far more robust and prominent way than the institution of slavery itself. And I thought that was so strange and so perverse. And I became increasingly interested in thinking about how in my city, in my hometown, what were the ways that it was attempting to reckon with and memorialize the story of slavery outside of the context of this treasonous army that was founded on and predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. How do we tell the story of slavery and the people who were subjected to it? And so then it sort of broadened my vision, and I started to think about how different places across the country reckon with or fail to reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery. And that's what ultimately led me to writing this book.
Awesome. That was fantastic. That truly was fantastic. So it was wonderful to hear Clint Smith, and he's around my age. I will be honest, this is one of those times when I was reading this, I'm like, what have I done with my life? Like, I know I've done something, but oh man, this is a fantastic book this man wrote. And it's really a blessing that he decided to take on this challenge so that we all could share in the learning that he participated in. He had a line on page 255 that really stuck with me, especially since I am trained as a historian. If you look at the bottom of the first, or right before the page break, he's talking with who is this? With Eloy, who's one of the historians who he engaged with to get an understanding of Gorée Island. This is when he was over in Senegal. And what was said to him was that history is written by the perpetrators. History is written by the perpetrators. See, we often read it as though history is written by the victors, but that's not the way that I interpreted this. History is written by those who engage in it. So one of the things I had the wonderful fortune of doing this last year was going and visiting Goree Island, as I'm sharing with you all right now to see. This is the door of no return. And I'll be honest, it was a disconcerting experience. Like, on one hand, it was an incredible place. Senegal is beautiful. Dakar is amazing. And Goree Island, so much culture. I mean, we took home a bunch of art that we were able to get produced there. But going to Les Maisons d'Esclaves was jarring because there were people running around, laughing, sort of enjoying themselves. And you realize that it was a place of torture, more than a prison, but a place of deep despair. As you can see when you look through this door, the interior of the sort of the home of the slaves, house of the slave, it's dark on the interior, and there's nothing but ocean. And the idea is that this would be the last door that people would have to go through, because once you left this door, you would go on a boat and you weren't coming back. There was no return. It was in some ways fulfilling, but I don't have the right word for it. It reminded me of the tragedy, as they said, of the transatlantic slave trade, for me to walk through this door several centuries after my ancestors left the continent, but to return and deny the lie that they were told that we would never come back. And yet there we still were. And so it's in that vein that I think we need to understand that history is not about who won and who lost, but who participated. And hopefully by reading and engaging with this text, our participation in this work will give us a sense of how we want to continue to engage in history. So what I like to do now is just kind of briefly go over some of the chapters, the 7 chapters in this text, some of the key points that I saw within them. And then what I'd like for us to do is break out into small groups. We have the breakout rooms. Everybody will be randomly assigned to a room, probably about 4 or 5 people. When you get in the room, introduce yourself, be friendly, try to do a little introduction, get a chance to know who your book talk members are. But in doing so, I'd like for you all to discuss what your highlights were. What were the parts of this book that really grabbed you? What were the parts that left you in despair? What were the parts that gave you encouragement? What was something that you learned that you didn't previously know? Basically, what is the word that you want to pass on in your group that when we come back from our breakout rooms, you'd like to pass on to the rest of the collective? That's going to be your assignment for this evening. But before we begin, I'm going to start by going through these chapters. I was looking at the first 2 chapters on Monticello Plantation and Whitney Plantation. There were things about these sections that really just struck me, they grabbed me. If we go to page 25, we see Smith, and he's at Monticello, and he's talking with Donna. Donna she's a historical aficionado, right? But she's come to Monticello just so that she can get a sense of herself of what Thomas Jefferson was. And she had no idea that he owned slaves. And so her friend Grace is saying, we studied Jefferson. The slavery part was not part of it. Well, it wasn't detailed, Donna shared. It didn't put any heart and thought into it. In high school and college, you didn't think these are families. These are moms and dads separated from each other. That wasn't part of the education. And Smith goes on to talk about how this was occurring at a time when family separation was part of the news cycle. But I think as he concludes in this chapter on page 51, as he says, as much as this land illuminates the contradictions of Jefferson's legacy, it also serves a reminder to the hundreds of Black people who made a home there. I would say the Black families that made a home there. So in many ways, the way that the word is passed is through that particular, we could say conservative, but that particular institution, that of family. And what enslavement in this country did was attack the ties of family for African Americans in a way that we're still recovering from today. But you know what I would also say, that it attacked the ways in which Anglo-Americans created family as well. When we consider the relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings, for all that it's worth and it's covered, the thing that it's not glossed over to me, but I had a colleague in grad school who was very into this idea of slavery as incest. She wrote a whole bunch of stuff on it, all these things. But when you begin to realize that Sally Hemings is the younger sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife, it really makes their relationship that much more complicated. Not just that it's a teenager that this 40-year-old man is taking, not just that it's a person who he owns, but that it's his wife's sister. In what ways do we understand, or can we reconcile what that means for a family, for someone to be able to take essentially their niece and turn them into a concubine? This is what takes me then to thinking about the Whitney plantation, where we see the depths of the depravity of enslavement. On page 64 in particular, I'm thinking of one of the ways that it's described, that people will say, and it isn't on 64, Lord forgive me, but that it's so difficult often for Black children to learn about slavery because there's this idea that it's going to be painful. They're not going to want to participate. I can attest to that. It was really hard for me to engage with slavery when I was younger. But there's this thing that he says on 64 that really sticks with me when he's describing why people like Douglass and Tubman and Harriet Jacobs, who, kiddos, we're going to read Harriet Jacobs later this semester. We're going to read some Douglass too. So just keep them in mind. They're exceptional, but they disprove, they're the exception that proves the rule. Frederick Douglass is known as one of the most, photographed men of the 19th century. I mean, Frederick Douglass is beyond incredible. It wouldn't matter what racial background he was. He did not see himself as anyone's slave. Harriet Tubman literally led the US military on raids into Southern territory. She served as a spy. This is after she does all the stuff on the Underground Railroad. And this is after also she had been struck in the head with an iron and had epileptic seizures at random. Harriet Tubman is like, there's no one who compares to her. That's why she's going to get on the $20 bill one of these days. So when we compare these folks to regular people, as he says here on 64, the insidiousness of white supremacy illuminates the exceptional in order to implicitly blame those who cannot, in the most brutal circumstances, attain superhuman heights. It does this instead of blaming the system. It blames instead the people who built it, or instead of blaming the system, or instead of blaming the people who built it and the people who maintained it. The ordinariness of our ancestors is only shameful when used to legitimize oppression. That's the line that really struck with me, because that's something that I didn't know how much I needed to hear. There is no, as Dr. King would say, there's no shame in being the descendants of enslaved people. There's greater shame in being the descendants of slave owners, which is what takes me to looking at chapter 3, where they talk about Angola prison. This is a very difficult chapter for me to get through, not just because of the way that it shows how servitude and voluntary servitude continues to this day, but in particular on page 107, with the botched electrocution of Willie Francis, a 17-year-old boy, that's younger than the students who are in my class, who was captured on spurious charges. Smith also talks about the way that in Louisiana, you can have split juries. So it's not as though the justice system was in his favor. He was a young person who was caught up in a system seeking to destroy Black life. And even though they failed the first time, and he describes in detail, the best way I can describe, this is on 109, is wham, zip. It felt like 100 and 1,000 needles and pins were pricking me all over. And my left leg felt like somebody was cutting it with a razor blade. I could feel my arms jumping up at my sides, and I guess my whole body must have jumped straight out. Then I was all right. I thought I was dead. Then they did it again, the same feeling all over again. And then when he said, take it off, take it off. That's what he wanted them to do. He really thought he was dead then. And so the year later, before he's killed by the state again, because nobody in this system sees fit to save him, he says, I know how it felt to have them read a death warrant to me. I know how it feels to sit in a cell waiting for the day they will lead me to the chair again. I sure know how it feels to sit in that chair and have them strap me in and put a mask over my eyes. I know how it feels to have the shock go through me and think I am dead and find out I am not. It's a hard word to pass along, and it's a hard word to have to carry. But it's important that we understand the history, not just from those who have committed it, but those who have experienced it. Because if we just hear the side of, as we would say, the victors, we don't understand the totality of the experience at hand. This is seen in the opposite lens when we look at the Blandford Cemetery. As we go on, the citation I want to look at is on page 130, where Smith is gone to Blandford, which is a Confederate cemetery. And he's describing on page 130 the cratered battlefield, because Blandford Church is on the cratered battlefield. And he says, for whites, seeing these Black men in Union uniforms represented a profound and infuriating turning point in the war, one that tapped into their worst impulses. The use of Black soldiers was a threat to the entire social order the South had been predicated upon. Black soldiers in the Union Army did not simply reflect a new demographic composition. Lee's army saw Black soldiers as participants in a slave revolt, an insurrection of the most nightmarish proportions that was being actively supported by Lincoln and the US government. The Confederate government put policies in place that officially considered Black soldiers slaves participating in an insurrection, similar in this sort of way to how the Union, or shall we say the federal government, released the Emancipation Proclamation as an order freeing enslaved people under the jurisdiction of states in rebellion. At the end of the day, in the Civil War, what we see is that while African Americans advocated, asserted, fought for their own freedom, between these two governments, they were pawns in a greater struggle over political sovereignty. So how did the Confederate government deal with the slave rebellion? They considered Black soldiers slaves and thus subject to re-enslavement or execution. And their white officers, as enablers of the insurrection, could also be executed. So when Lee's men encountered Black soldiers in battle, they expressed explicit disdain for their adversaries. And it goes on to describe the ways that Confederate soldiers would effectively slaughter surrendering African-American troops, along with the officers who were leading them. And this is where we in contrast, we go to page 149 or 148, where Smith is talking with Jeff, who has a long salt and pepper ponytail, adorned in Confederate badges. He says, whatever they believed in, we're all trying to fight for freedom. That's all that this was a battle over. And then there's a story of Jeff on page 149, who attached himself as a servant to a Confederate officer during the war. But how is the story of Jeff then construed as though he fought for the Confederacy and not that he followed an officer? It's in the way that this word gets told, how it's filtered through time, that we wind up having these competing narratives of what happened, what's real and what's not. This is part of the struggle of history, but this is also why groups like this are so important, because now is a time for us to come together and actually discuss what is it that we understand to have happened, and how are we going to understand, when faced with the horrors of the past, how to reconcile them and try to move forward into the future. And so that's where I want to think about the fifth and sixth chapter. So about Galveston Island and New York City. I'm looking right now on page 179, which is where Smith was talking about the pain of the historical legacy of slavery and why often it's believed young people feel so overwhelmed if they learn about it. But I want to also move on to a line on 197, where he's at the Neocultural Center and they're having a discussion on the Juneteenth holiday. And the director of the center, she says to Smith, the community, in my opinion, needs to do more to educate rather than just celebrate. that line really stuck with me too, because it's this question then of what is the purpose of telling these stories? I mean, if we think of some of our collective civic holidays, right? I could tell you about Columbus Day because I know what happened in 1492 when the Ocean Blue was sailed. Or I could tell you about the 4th of July, about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are things that we tell each other over and over and over again. But it's in that same sense of then what are the stories we need to tell, not so that we celebrate these narratives, but that we can learn from them, which is where I think I want to conclude with my remarks, thinking about the development of Central Park. If we look on in page 231, where he's speaking with his tour guide, Damaris, and she's asking if there's anything in the city that he should visit. And she says Central Park. Central Park was built on Seneca Village, which was a neighborhood for free Black people. That was their settlement and that was their territory. I don't think a lot of people know that. So you go to Central Park and people don't know they're on the remains of a free Black community. And to bring it back to Phoenix, one of the reasons this is so jarring to hear is because we have a legacy of eminent domain in Phoenix as well. And I don't want to get too presentist, so I'm not going to bring up the light rail extension into South Phoenix. But what's often brought up is the destruction of the Golden Gate barrio immediately to the west of Sky Harbor Airport. During the 60s and 70s, at a time when eminent domain was being used to bulldoze homes through Central Phoenix for the development of the 10, the Golden Gate neighborhood was to the west of Sky Harbor. And to accompany additional jet traffic, the city needed to create more space for a safe landing area. And so that neighborhood in many ways was sacrificed for the development of a larger, modern airport system. Now, many of these folks, they may not have wanted to have left. They may not have wanted to have left, but due to the policy of eminent domain, the municipal government had not just the right, but the authority to purchase their homes at a negotiated price and then send them off wherever they would be. Where they often wind up moving, and because this is where the Golden Gate Community Center relocates, is to the West Valley, over to Maryvale, where many of their descendants remain to this day. So eminent domain, family separation, genocide and race war and this sort of thing. These are words that are passed down, and they're ways that through memory, they're taught to us. But the question is how strong or how fallible is our memory? Is our memory accurate? What voices has our memory included? So what I'd like for you all to do, take about 10 minutes, we're gonna say, 10 to 15. I'll check in on everybody, see how you're feeling. But we're gonna break into small groups. I'm gonna break us up into groups of, we'll say, I like 3. Yeah, I like 3. We'll break into groups of 5, and I like everyone to just introduce themselves, sort of start sharing your feelings, your emotions, your thoughts about the text. What is it that grabbed you? What is it that you didn't know? What is it that surprised you? What is it that you want to go and take and spread a word about? We'll do that in our small groups, and then eventually we'll come back and have a collective discussion on what it is that we've learned from this text and how we think we can continue to spread the word going forward. Hey everybody, I hope that wasn't too abrupt. I tried to give a heads up, but sometimes my Zoom shortcomings, they're real. They're real. But okay. How was that? Thumbs up, sideways, thumbs down. A lot of thumbs up. That's great to see. Thank you. All right. Well, where I'd like to start is just sort of opening the floor. What were some of the things that you all discussed in your groups? Was there anything particularly stimulating? Thank you for that, Mom. Was there anything particularly that anyone's feeling like they really want to share, that the spirit's moving them to share with the rest of us?
I want to share something. Is that okay? And I was in Catherine and Donna's and Alicia and Lisa's breakout room, and we started talking about how place is, obviously significant and it's historical. And my observation reading the book is that the body is a place as well. The body is a site of historical legacy and historical significance. And I thought it was really interesting the way that Clint Smith interwove just the importance of the body as a site of memory and nostalgia and history. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
So the body as a place, I think there's a way of thinking through this, that there's levels, right? That there's what's internal, but then there's also what's external. So it's a question of how we're defining place as we're thinking through it. What else was there? Thank you so much for sharing that, Elaine.
Yep. On that note, we talked about how, each of the chapters could be read separately, but there are these themes that wove through them. And so one of that, and again, it's the body, but what I found, and obviously I am not a Black person and I am not a Black man, but his experience at these sites, and again, related to the body. I mean, there were several places where he said, I feel uncomfortable. I feel a dissonance. Like, what is happening here? It doesn't even feel right. And he's, and we were saying he's stretching his arms out in the Angola prison cell saying, how is this right? How can a body live in this small amount of space? And yeah, it's so profound to me. And it challenges, I think, the work we do when we are interpreting historic sites, to really think about how different people are going to experience that space and that story differently. And we shouldn't shy away from that. I think we don't want to make people uncomfortable at times as public historians. And I think that's an essential part of the experience when we're telling difficult stories.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm curious as to how you all understand that idea of what it means to tell a difficult story. What is it specifically that makes a story difficult, and what are the ways that, after reading this text, you think it can be better managed?
I think if you start from how it can be better managed is to have the right people tell the story. It's not our story to tell. We were talking about it from my framework has been a lot of focus on Native American communities the last few years. And the ashamed also led to the comment that I wrote earlier, was the fact that I wasn't thinking beyond that more recently, because what we're hearing is so pervasive on the news all the time. You get, I hate to say numb to it, but it's there in what the Black experience is in our everyday lives. And I can't experience that. Yet when I talk to my Native American colleagues, I am hearing their stories and the pain that they are feeling. And that's what I read in this book, that this person has this history that he has grown up with, or at least embraced over the latter portion of his later youth and into adulthood, that he has now he has that history himself that he is telling his stories from. I think that's where I get it from, is that it's not up to me to tell the story, but to find the people that should be telling that story in our line of work.
I also think it has to do with a consciousness of reinterpretation, because a lot of I'm a historic preservationist by trade, so I'm always thinking about places and the stories that go with the physical places, and very very few places, historical places, are as overtly tragic as an Auschwitz or something like that. There's so many more physical places and historical sites that we think we know what happened, or it's currently being interpreted in one way, like a Monticello, for instance. But in fact, there's so much more that needs to be researched. It needs to be told, and just being willing to not be comfortable with the way a historical site is being currently interpreted, and sort of having the bravery to say, like, we've been wrong about this, we need to retell this story.
You can always ask the question, what are we missing in our interpretation?
Yeah.
But then I also found it was interesting, at least in the case of Goray, is, okay, so what if we are wrong? Like, what if that doorway isn't a doorway? What if that's just not possible, that it had to be something else? Does that matter? And I really love the concept that he brought up. It's actually Pierre Bourdieu's concept, sincere fiction. That like, in our obsession of historical detail, why do we demand that every detail necessarily be right if what it's representing in the whole is what's important? And I think, again, to tie it back to what we do in historic preservation, a lot of the work we've done with sacred sites and traditional cultural properties and preservation, we are always telling various cultural groups, well, you need to have all these facts right. And we, the preservationists, are the fact checkers. The historians are, we're so obsessed with fact. But the reality is, these are places where these are stories and traditions and subjectivities, and it doesn't make the place any less important if the facts don't line up. So I thought that was really interesting.
I don't say this in a way of being a troll in any way, shape, or form. It's just, I will do this with students. It's like, you have to problematize the question. Like, what is a fact, though? Like, there's a way that we can say, oh, well, we've done our research and we know I've seen this particular record here, there, and then in the third place, and it's written down, and, it's scrolled somewhere, like, but we have our fetishes as historians. And so there is this way that we take something as though it's, I don't know if I want to say this golden truth, but without actually paying attention to what facts obscure, right? Like, there's that line, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Like, there's so much of violence that facts actually do. So I think then it becomes a question, going kind of to Mary Ellen's point, of like, how do we determine not just what facts to use, but how do we determine, I don't know if we want to say objectively, but how are we going to bring facts together to tell a more comprehensive story? Even to Ariana's point, where she was saying, what happens when the facts are wrong and the story is wrong, and we have to admit that we need to change them? To me, it seems like there's a deeper question here of what it means to pursue historical truth that he's getting at by describing the oral traditions that he had to uncover to find out how to tell this story.
We get obsessed with, as historians, we're indoctrinated with this idea of primary sources. We need to find our information somewhere very specific, and it's only worth it if it's of this caliber, or if it was written in this newspaper. And like you said, almost always, these primary sources are published by the perpetrators, and there are many other ways to collect facts or relevant and important parts of the story.
It's where the oral history projects that are going on. We've got a couple of surveys going on about different, like Tucson's doing an African American survey looking for historic properties associated with African Americans. Flagstaff was doing something similar in I believe it's the Sunnyside neighborhood, and oral histories are a big part of that. Because since it's not written down anywhere, in a couple of cases, the written records were destroyed. It's finding the people who actually remember the events happening, and there's been an effort in both of those places to do that and get those stories recorded so we know what they are.
That's a good point. I think that Smith's work really makes a very good argument for the need for oral history. Like,
Yeah.
I wanted to say, I'm not a professional amongst all of you. I'm an observer and an inquirer. And what struck me about this book and about his method was that really we could be him. We could discover what he discovered, because what he did was he went to these sites and he asked questions, and then he listened to the answers. He got those stories from people who were there. So it's not some kind of academic work, however important that is. I'm not trivializing what you all are doing, but I'm saying we can do that too as citizens, as concerned people, to want to know the truth as truth questers. We can go and ask those same questions that he asked when he went to Monticello, right? Or when he went to the prison, or when he was like he didn't say, oh, here I am doing a big study, tell me what happened here. No, he didn't. He asked the people in the cemetery, who's here, what, and to me, that was the genius of this book and his method. And that impressed me so much that really, what did he do? He went and asked the questions, and he stood and listened to the answers, and he engaged the people that were there. And to me, that's the genius of this book. And we can do that. We don't have to have PhDs. We can ask the questions and keep asking them until we really feel like we have some truth and some understanding that we didn't have before. This book is genius. And to me, it's not an academic book. He didn't approach his research as an accommodation. He didn't, or even a researcher. He just was a tourist wandering by and asked a bunch of good questions, is really how the book presented itself to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. It was very engaging and personal, yet told a big sweeping story about these places, and that's one of the ways it made it so easy for people to connect to it.
People like me who are not educated in the process. Yes.
I am very proud of my education, but I was into history long before it began. Actually, the thing that got me into history was reading about World War II. And as a child, I'd go to the library and I'd read all the books I can. And World War II, the way that it's written in the American historiography, I don't want to say jingoistic, but it's the last good war, we won, blah, 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 blah. And I remember, yeah, it's the greatest generation, all that stuff. And I remember talking with a doctor I met. She was a Russian lady, and she was like, Russia won World War II. And so I think that's one of the questions I have for you all. It's more so, how do we reconcile competing narratives? Because I think that's one of the things we see in Blanchford Cemetery, right? That you have these competing narratives over what is the war being fought over? Is it states' rights? Is it slavery? Is it freedom? Is it northern aggression? Is it, unjust rebellion? How, in that sense, do you all see, not just as professionals, but just as folks trying to get a sense of what our history is, that we can go about trying to bring these competing perspectives into one overarching narrative?
I would like to give an example, maybe that could answer that question. Sometime about 10 or 15 years ago, we were celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. They called it CW 150. And especially back east, that was very, very prominent. The governor at that time of Virginia said that every county had to have a CW 150 committee. So I do my historic preservation work in Southern Virginia, Mecklenburg County. And the local committee, so I live here in Arizona. I live in Arizona. I have my work in Southern Virginia. So the local committee for CW 150, they couldn't find any African Americans to serve on this committee. So I'm known because of my work. And they said, would you serve on this committee? And I said, well, I really don't live in Virginia. Is that valid for me to be representing the county since I'm not a resident of the county? And they said, well, the only people who really answered our call were people who were from the Sons of the Confederacy and the Daughters of the Confederacy. And one white person, these are white people telling me, there's white colleagues, white friends. And they said some of these people who are members of these organizations, they are still fighting the Civil War, not celebrating 150 years. They're still fighting the war. And I had to laugh at that because one person said, yeah, and it's really scary. Because on one hand, that was funny. These guys, they think they're still living in 1863. And on the other hand, it is scary. And so these are the competing narratives. I got on the committee and we did the work of the committee that was inclusive. Later, for those people who didn't want to serve on the committee or who wanted to dominate the committee. And so we have to, in our group, we talked about what's right. We have to be inclusive now. We're moving into a new era. We're recognizing these facts and we're recognizing the truths. As Toni Morrison makes this distinction between the facts and the truths. And so in this sense, we're human and we want to be a more progressive nation when it comes to race and racism and to deal with it. And it's very hard. It's a difficult dialogue. But that's just an example of a municipality trying to deal with competing narratives. And if we're competing and if there's a winner, I think we won because we forged ahead and we had CW 150 and we had a positive African-American experience dealing with that.
So Angelita, I have to ask, did you guys build a program that would be considered inclusive of, essentially the lost cause, the lost cause folks, as well as the more progressive history-minded folks? Like,
Well, we built
did
a
you actually
website.
do that?
Yes, we did. We built a website, and actually the website, I have to admit, is damn good. It's still up. I can put it in the chat. I was surprised because I needed some quick information, Catherine, and I went to that website that we built. I need some historical background. And I said, oh, I'll go to the website because it has that information. So yes, despite the presence of those people who are still fighting the Civil War, we did the website. We got citations for it. We got a prize for it and so on. And I was surprised the county still has the website up.
Very cool.
And it's inclusive. It has some good stuff on it. I will get it and send and put it on the chat.
Thank you for that, Angelita. I am curious about what y'all think. I'm a believer in the Faulkner quote, history is not past, it's not even past, or something along those lines. Somebody will know it better than I do. I'm not a Southern Gothic scholar. But that being said, I'm not sure we're not still fighting the Civil War in the same way that if we think of settler colonialism, right, as a structure, not an event, I'm not sure that we are not continuing the colonization of indigenous lands. So I do think it's a question then of how do we, I don't know if I want to say engage, but figure out how to recognize that there are some perspectives in some ways that are irreconcilable because they're seeking competing sovereignties. they're seeking competing outcomes. I think that's why, for me, the Blanchford Cemetery section is so, not even just jarring, but I mean, it gets down to the meaning of that conflict, right? On one hand, you had a war to restore the Union. On the other hand, you had a slave rebellion. Which one you see is a question of perspective. I'm not sure that those two, thank you, the past is never dead, it's not even past, but I'm not sure that those two perspectives could be reconciled. And I think that's why the lost cause in that sense is still going on to this day, when we consider then that some people are understanding. I'm assuming they truly understand that in their mind, it was better for a white supremacist state to exist, one in which people of African descent did not have rights, people of African descent performed labor, people of African descent could be tortured and abused, because that was part of the system that kept that society in place. So I do think it is a question of how do we reconcile that with folks who at the same time want to celebrate freedom, emancipation, so on and so forth. I'd be very curious in hearing how you all think we can approach that.
Well, I'm going to have to look at Angelita's website. I don't know. I wish I could.
I just sent it.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that, because to me, it's just like, how do you, to me, the whole, the reality of folks that still emblazon, their vehicle with like a Confederate flag is it to memorialize, the fact that, there was this horrible war that just basically decimated our country over a, essentially an issue that, was an economic issue, I guess, but also like the biggest human rights issue that you can possibly imagine, folks' right to be like free from bondage and slavery and have body autonomy. I don't know how you reconcile that. I mean, I guess where that really comes to blows is when you start talking to people about removing Confederate memorials, because people honestly believe that those memorials are history. Like, you're rewriting history. You remove a memorial, you're rewriting history, you're denying history. And it's like, whoa, no, a memorial is not history. Like that thing that's at Wesley Bolin Plaza is not, well, it's not there anymore, actually, because it's gone now, but that there's nothing historical about that. That is people coming together and basically saying we are entrenched in a conception of history that is so tenuous that we need to put it on a rock somewhere and plant our flag, in, so to speak, in Arizona soil.
While at the same time the Confederate Memorial controversy was going on, those same people wanting to save it weren't concerned about the one Civil War battlefield that we have in Arizona, which is slated to become a railroad switchyard at some point, which is down by Picacho Peak. No one was concerned about the fate of that place, only memorials that showed up in the 1960s, I think.
Yeah, because it's not about history.
Right.
It's about hate. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know. Like,
Well, perhaps that is the question. What is the place of hate in history?
It has a place in history. Again, if I may share my experience in Mecklenburg County, a very conservative place. The Bible Belt, Blacks are also conservative as much as the whites. And there was the Confederate statue with the soldier in the square in the capital of the county. And in my thinking, I said that monument will never come down in Mecklenburg County, in Boynton. It's not going to come down. One person on the Board of Supervisors, the County Board of Supervisors, an African-American whose ancestors went back centuries to both Blacks and whites. He claimed both sides. And he brought this up as the chair of the Board of Supervisors. And eventually, I'm making a long story short, they took a vote on it. And the vote was something like 4-5, maybe. And then one person said, oh, I'm not going to vote. And then they had to vote again. Eventually, the majority of the vote, and these are mainly white people on the board, they voted to move that monument from the county park, from the in front of the courthouse. They moved it. And I was just so shocked that that happened in 2020. I think it was 2020. And so finally, the footnote to that is I asked this beloved friend who has since passed, I said, where did they move the monument? He says, oh, they put it in the cemetery down the street. They literally moved the monument to a church cemetery. Okay. And I said, do you see the symbolism of that? He said, they didn't know what to do with it. So they put it, I said, why couldn't they bury it? They said, maybe they will bury it, but they just moved it to the cemetery to get it off the court, in front of the courthouse. So this type of enlightenment, we all have to work for this new age, for this what we feel is inclusivity, what we believe is a reckoning with history. It's a reckoning with racism. It's a reckoning with slavery now, with everything that's happening. And so we all have different platforms. We don't have to have PhDs. We don't have to be academics. But we have this new consciousness that we want to pass on to the next generation.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Angelita. We're coming up on time. So, or do we have, how long do we have, Donna? I know somewhere between 8:30 and 9.
Yeah, no, we do. We do have a little closing, so don't leave.
Okay. Well,
When you're done, it's Alicia's turn.
Yeah, I think we told folks 8:30.
well, in that sense, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think I just want to, there's something I wanted to close with, because he had what was it? He spoke on Thomas Jefferson's Notes of the State of Virginia, and he commented, and this is a real thing though, how Jefferson in particular goes after Phyllis Wheatley, and he says to her about her that, you know, basically her poetry is not of note, that she has not written anything that Jefferson found is worth being paid attention to. So there was one poem of Phyllis Wheatley's I wanted to read to you all before I conclude my segment. I guess this is my way of saying thank you. I really appreciate having the opportunity to facilitate this discussion. It was enriching and enlivening. I'm glad I got a chance to read this book. I'm gonna need to take a very long hot bath after this though. But all right, so this is by Phyllis Wheatley, A Hymn to the Evening. Soon as the sun forsook the eastern main, the pealing thunder shook the heavenly plain. Majestic grandeur from the zephyr's wing exhales the incense of the blooming spring. Soft purl the streams, the birds renew their notes, and through the air their mingled music floats. Through all the heavens, what beauteous dyes are spread, but the west glories in the deepest red. So may our breasts with every virtue glow, the living temples of our God below. Filled with the praise of him who gives the light and draws the sable curtains of the night, let placid slumbers soothe each weary mind, and morn to wake more heavenly, more refined. More pure, so shall the labors of the day begin, more pure, more guarded from the snares of sin. Night's leaden scepter seals my drowsy eyes, then cease my song till fair aurora rise. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Donna, you're muted.
I wanted to thank you all for coming, and I really enjoyed your discussion points and everything that you had to say. I did want to share that our next book club event will be April 25th and we will be discussing braiding sweetgrass. by Rob.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you all for coming. Thank you for those who stuck in, and especially many, many thanks to Dr. Pratcher for an inspired discussion and so well moderated that I now will never moderate a book club because I cannot do this as well. Like, you have set the bar like super, super high.
And one thing
Thank
to
you,
note,
Catherine.
if you would like to see this again, we have recorded it and we
Yes.
will post it.
Yeah. We've recorded
let
it,
you know.
and feel free to share with friends. And we hope to see you in April. All right.
Happened to March.
Well,
March.
we're just not on it. Like, we need time to read the books.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
So
Thank
far, I'm
you.
2 for 2. I've read both of the ones. I've read
Well,
both.
good. You're already there. All right. Take care, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
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 Bye.